Hello, everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Jennifer Hansen, and I'm a registered dietitian and the director of Nutrition Systems. I would like to welcome you to this edition of our dietitian-led nutrition series called Nourish to Flourish. For those of you who have joined us in the past, we're glad you're back, and if this is your first time joining us, then welcome. This series was created as a direct response to so many of you asking for more educational material and content on nutrition. And our hope is that today and for our upcoming webinars, that you'll find the information that we'll be sharing to be relevant and useful. We would like to give a special thanks to Anita Holmes and the Resident Liaison Association for their input with this nutrition series, and to Eric Williams, Melissa Sanders, and Simon Zhao for all of their efforts behind the scenes and helping us bring this nutrition series to you. We greatly appreciate all of their support. For today's topic, our speaker will be discussing sodium and the use of salt in the diet. And a quick plug for next month, our next webinar will be on Wednesday, October 18th from 2 to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And the topic will be on blood sugar management. So please mark your calendars. We would love for you to attend. Before we get started, there are a few things I'd like to cover. First, please note everyone joining the call today will be placed on mute to ensure that there's no background noise and that it's easy to hear our speaker. So if you have a question, please feel free to write it in the chat box below. We will save some time at the end to answer as many questions as possible. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded, so if you choose not to be recorded, then we ask that you please turn your camera off. With that, I would like to take a moment and introduce today's speaker. Our speaker today is Annetta Theo. Annetta is a registered dietitian and the Assistant Director of Dining Services at the Terraces of San Joaquin Gardens. Annetta has been a dietitian for the past 3 years, and prior to that was a health coach for 5 years. Annetta received her Bachelor of Science degree from Georgia State University and her Master's in Nutrition and Dietetics from Marywood University. Some fun facts to share regarding Annetta is that she's originally from Tallinn, Estonia, and moved to the United States at the age of 10. And when she's not working, Annetta enjoys being out in nature, gardening, and painting with watercolor. And so with that, Annetta, if you're ready, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. And as you were sharing that, I realized that salt actually is, if you've ever done watercolors, can be used to add to the watercolors as they're drying. And it actually creates some really nice effects in watercolor. So salt has a lot of uses. So the topic for today is secrets of sodium and learning how to be heart healthy. And hopefully what you will take away from this presentation is that different roles of salt, but even actually salt can be used in art too. So I just learned that recently myself. I am at the Terraces of San Joaquin Gardens in Fresno. And as you heard, I started my journey on the East Coast, and now I have the fortune of living here, and it's very beautiful. And I'm very excited to be here with you today. For this presentation today, I want us to start with a little poll question. And I would like to know from all of you whether or not salt is made up of sodium and chloride. Is that true or false? And you should be able to see a poll question pop up, and you'll be able to select true or false. And I'll give you all a moment. All right, it looks like we have everyone saying true, that salt is made of sodium and chloride together. I'll give you a couple of moments. Okay, everybody. Okay, there's one person who said false. I like that. Okay, very good. So we had about 8 people say true and 1 person say false. So I'll go ahead and end the poll and show you the results. All right, so it's kind of a trick question. right? Sodium and salt. Sodium is an element. It is also known as Na on the periodic table. And salt is made of sodium and chloride together, because you have the sodium joining up with chloride, and that's what we know as table salt. So for those of you who said true, it is true. What we know of as salt traditionally is made up of sodium and chloride, but other salts in nature can actually have other elements in there. So I thought that it was kind of almost a trick question. So if you've taken biology and you were thinking to yourself, maybe this is false, you are also right. But typically, yes, salt is made of sodium and chloride together. So a little bit of history. We'll start our journey by looking at some pictures to kind of look at what salt excavation essentially looks like. And we as human beings have been mining salt for a very, very long time. Before I tell you a little bit of history, I just remembered a story that I heard on TV once where I believe it was Top Chef or one of those kinds of culinary TV shows. And all of these chefs were asked, if you were going to be stranded on an island and you could only take one ingredient with you for cooking, I guess, what would it be? And one of the chefs said salt. And a lot of chefs actually agreed with them. So if they were to be stranded on a deserted island and they had nothing else with them, they said they would actually choose salt. And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that I actually agree with them. I have a confession to make. I actually love salt. And in researching this topic, I kind of fell in love with salt all over again. So I want to take you on this journey about a little bit of history, the different kinds of salt, how we use salt in our communities, and what are some healthy ways of using salt in general for your health. So we're going to look at many different things, but I love salt because I think maybe chefs would agree with me, that salt really helps to bring out the flavor in foods, and salt historically has been very important. So if you take a look at your screen, I've put some pictures up. If I grew up in Europe, as I told you, I'm from Tallinn, Estonia, but one thing I remember as a child is seeing a lot of salted fish, and that's a very popular thing. I don't know if any of you have ever had that growing up, or maybe it's part of your culture as well. It has always historically been very prevalent where I grew up. So you have some salted fish hanging. You also see this sort of excavator and these huge mountains of white salt. So these operations are very, very large, where they have to go in there and actually get it out from the earth and dry it and purify it so that they can serve it to us. If you take a look to your right, you see this pink sort of terraces, and you have these salt terraces, and they are evaporating, and the salt is then collected once it goes through a process. And then you see in the center page sort of these mounds of white salt with different various colors in there. Sodium chloride is typically going to be white because it's more pure. So you have the sodium and the chloride together, and that white color is very specific to table salt. But in nature, if you're looking at these, you can kind of see different colors there. And part of the reason for that is because there's other elements in there. You know, there could be trace minerals in there as well. And so some of these colors, as you're looking at the pictures, some of those colors are coming from different elements as well. And then different cultures historically have had different methods of getting salt from seawater, for example. So in your top right picture, you kind of see somebody standing in some water, and they're essentially gathering salt from these salt beds and helping to dry it out. And really, humans have been on the hunt for salt since the beginning of time. In the Shang Dynasty in ancient China, beginning around 1600 BC, salt production began on a very large scale. So as soon as humans figured out what salt was for and just how much it could do in terms of preserving food, but also for flavor, they started to produce it on a large scale. And that was 1600 BC in China. And Himalayan rock salt, they think that it was laid down about 500 million years ago. And these accumulations of what we know as the pink salt, Himalayan pink salt, has been there for millions and millions of years. And when it became available and we realized that we could mine it, we started to excavate for salt. And even the ancient Egyptians also really valued salt, and it was part of their religious rites, and they had a lot of cultural practices around salt as well. And then let's see, some of the earliest salt traders in recorded history would trade salt and with different cultures, and it found its way all across the globe. And archaeologists think that salt production started as early as 5400 BCE. So we as humans have had a very long-standing practice of looking for salt, and finding different ways of using salt. All right, let's take a look. So a little bit more history. According to the History Channel, salt has profoundly affected human history, and it has been incredibly important in establishing early civilization. So for example, Venice started to tax salt, and the profits from this taxation helped to build the beautiful city of Venice. I don't know if any of you have traveled there, but I have not. I've seen pictures, but it is gorgeous. And historians say that one of the reasons they were able to build some of that is through taxing salt. And one of the resources I read is that Gandhi's earliest campaigns also were related to giving Indian people the ability to sell their own salt. And so they didn't have to buy it from Great Britain. So there was some autonomy they gained from that as well. And then you just have some pictures of Himalayan salt on the right corner, and then a different kind of salt on the top here. And then I don't know if you all like podcasts, but there is one particularly interesting one, Gastropod. They talk a lot about science and history as it relates to food. And they talk about how salt was considered rare until quite recently. And hardly surprising that throughout history, salt has been the engine behind empires and revolutions. And historians support this fact. Salt was so valued even that even the word sol, from salt, it was attributed to the word salary, soldier, and even salad, right? We use salt, veggies as well. So some of these word origins can kind of even indicate to us how important salt has been to human civilization and growth. So if you love salt, now you know why. We're kind of predisposed to love it. Our brains love it. We perceive it very easily. And our palate really likes it, and it really helps to enhance the flavors in foods. And as early as 800 BC in China, they were already gathering salt. So there's a couple ways we currently use salt. In particular, we use it for food preservation and in the food industry. One of the things that is kind of very important just in mass production of food is the use of salt. What it helps to do is that it helps reduce bitterness in different products, and thereby it helps to help us perceive sweetness a little bit more. So one hidden ingredient in baked goods and pies, especially in crusts and things like that, that you might not think about is actually salt. So baked goods, unless they're made at home and you're controlling the ingredients, will oftentimes have salt in it. And I know a lot of my residents sometimes find that to be a very surprising fact. But there's definitely salt in those baked goods. And part of the reason is because it helps with food preservation, and it also helps to reduce bitterness and enhance the perception of sweetness. Let's see, history. Okay, so that is the history. I find it incredibly fascinating that humans have always been really interested in salt and that we have used it in a lot of different ways. So then the question becomes, what is a healthy way of having salt in our diets, given its importance, because it is an element that is important for life. A lot of biological processes require sodium. We want to take a look at what are the healthiest options for us, and how can we monitor our salt intakes? What are the different kinds of salt? where's the salt found in our food. So we can kind of start to get into that. But before we do, I just wanted to share really quickly. I love this picture on the right. One thing that is a trend, and I don't know if you all have heard of it, but we have these things called gourmet salts. And chefs sometimes like to use these because you have things like applewood smoked salt, for example, or hickory smoked salt. We have found ways to give new flavors and flavor profiles to salt. And these are called finishing salts. And they can be used on top of a dish to kind of enhance a dish. And you would just use very tiny amounts. And so there's a lot of interesting things being done with salt as well. So I just wanted to mention that. We usually don't use these in our communities, but I just wanted to point that out because that is something interesting that's happening out in the world. All right, let's take a look at our baseline recommendations. You probably all have heard that salt and sodium is very important in our cardiovascular health. So it is going to be the key thing that we look at when we are looking at things like managing hypertension and managing our heart health in general. Salt is going to be key for that. In general, people with high blood pressure should get between 1,500 and 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. For those of you who have wondered about what the upper limit of that is, it used to be, they would always say, and you might have heard this, that 2,000 milligrams of sodium a day is what everybody should shoot for. But they have done a lot of research recently, and the consensus seems to be is that 2,300 milligrams is kind of the upper end. Now, of course, if you do have a medical condition or some other chronic condition, sometimes your doctor will tell you, okay, we need to get you down less than 2,000 milligrams a day. And so they might say something like 1,500, but that would be something that a doctor might tell you. In general, people who are following a general healthy diet would want to shoot for between 1,500 and 2,300. And you might be wondering to yourself, okay, well, what does that look like? 2,300 milligrams is going to be about a teaspoon of salt. And then, of course, the other question that typically comes up, which I like to point out as a baseline recommendation, even if you are, for example, taking medication for high blood pressure, it is still really important for you to factor in how much sodium you get throughout the day. And we are definitely mindful of that. I know, and just in general as well, as we get older, our blood pressure can be affected. So those kinds of changes are quite common. And so we do tend to watch our sodium in our meals and things like that. So for example, what we do at my community is we will have 2 vegetable options, for example, and the second one will be an unseasoned option, and that really helps to lower sodium as well. And I will take you through an example of what our menus look like and our nutrient analysis and kind of show you what are the different ways that you can have salt, which salt is really tasty, right? It makes food taste really good. But what are some strategies that we can use to kind of lower that? Because I know watching blood pressure and heart health is something that a lot of us are really interested in. All right, let's move on to poll question number 2. I would love to know, do you think, is this true or false? Most Americans don't consume enough salt in their diet. All right, let's take a look. And then you should be able to see the poll question come up for you. Everybody already knows, huh? I have about 12 people saying that that's false, and 1 person says it's true. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results with you. All right. So most Americans do consume enough salt in their diet. And part of the reason for that is because of convenience foods and anything that you would typically get at a grocery store that's pre-made. We do have to watch our sodium for that. And that's because of the food production process. Salt is one of the best and easiest ways to help us give longevity to food products. So if we are eating a generally varied diet, we go out to eat, maybe we buy things from the store, we are definitely going to meet our requirements for sodium for the day. So let's take a look here, just a couple of facts. Let's take a look at what normal blood pressure can look like for the average person. So typically when you're going to the doctor's office and they're measuring your blood pressure, they're going to look for something like 120/80. So if you look at the bottom of your screen, you see the classification system. It's usually broken down into 3 criteria, I guess. You have your normal range, you have your elevated range, which is where you start to kind of creep up, and your doctor might say something like, okay, we need to watch your blood pressure. Maybe we can look at it through diet, maybe we can look at other things that you're doing, but an elevated blood pressure, they'll start to talk to you about it. And then we have high blood pressure, and that's going to be something that is chronic, where you're consistently seeing blood pressure that is 130/80 or higher consistently. Normal range is about 120/80. And of course, sometimes people, depending on their activity level, if they do a lot of sports or if they generally have, they might have a number that's right for them. So for example, I sometimes will run 110/80, but I'm typically 110. If I'm going to 120, that's kind of on the higher end for me. So there's nuances like that. But in general, we're looking at 120/80 as being something that is in the normal range. Now, as we get older, our lifestyles change, eating patterns change. We start to notice that, and we can tell just from research and understanding eating patterns that lifestyle does have an effect on hypertension and high blood pressure. And according to researchers, about 1/3 of adults have hypertension. So that's quite a few people, as you can imagine. The bell curve at the top, if you take a look to your top left, we're looking at people with high blood pressure, normotensive, that just means people with normal blood pressure, and prehypertensive, those who are in that sort of elevated range, they're on their way to having high blood pressure. As you can tell, those people with high blood pressure tend to consume less sodium. And you might be wondering, okay, well, what does that mean? If you look at the bell curve, it's essentially saying that they eat a little bit less sodium than the average person who has normal blood pressure. What that means is that in general, those who have higher blood pressure already know that sodium is something that will help them keep their blood pressure in check. So that's great news. It means that most of us already understand that a healthier lifestyle that includes eating less salt is something that's really beneficial for us. So that's the good news. You might be listening in and realizing that sodium is something that's important for you to control, and you might be looking for strategies or different ways of looking at sodium, and you want to know what are some of the beneficial foods, what are some of the foods I should watch out for, how can I help my blood pressure, keep it in check, but also eat well. If you have heard any of my other talks or you've heard me talk about food in general, I love food. I love salt. I want to be able to enjoy it, but I don't want to get hypertension later on. So for example, in my family, high blood pressure is something that we're affected with. So I have to be careful. And as I continue to eat how I eat, I have to be mindful of that. So I have had to figure out, and also talking to different residents, try to figure out, okay, how are we going to look at the sodium thing and enjoy our meals? And that's always my goal, to enjoy my food, but also make sure that I'm not having higher blood pressures because of the salt content. And then we are going to take the average. So I tell those who I talk with, especially if they have hypertension, to shoot for about 2,000 milligrams a day, unless their doctor tells them it needs to be more or less than that. But really, we don't want to go over 2,300. And I will show you some numbers as well. So I probably don't have to tell you that Cardiovascular disease is very, very common, and this is the reason we're having this talk. But just to mention it one more time, heart disease is the #1 cause of death, and stroke is #5 cause of death. So this is probably on a lot of people's minds. Cardiovascular health is the one thing that is really affecting a lot of people, but also it is the one thing that we can kind of start to look at in terms of our lifestyle and how we're eating. And something as simple as reducing your sodium intake even by 500 milligrams a day can make a significant difference in your health. So let's do another quick poll question. This is the last one. I might have mentioned it, but true or false, 1 teaspoon of salt contains approximately 2,300 milligrams of sodium. All right, you should see the poll question on your screen. What do you think? 2,300 milligrams sounds like a lot, doesn't it? It does sound like a lot. And remember, on average, we want to shoot for 2,000, but 2,300 according to research is still okay. So that's the upper end. And is that 1 teaspoon? All right, it looks like most people agree that yes, that's true. I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you. So most people did agree. And that is true. 1 teaspoon of salt does contain about that much. So the question then becomes, if 2,300 milligrams, which is 1 teaspoon, is about how much you should have a day, what's the strategy here? 1 teaspoon doesn't seem like a lot, right? You do a little pinch here, a little pinch there, and then it starts to add up. And then if you're having like French fries or chips, if you're a chip lover like I am, or if you want a flatbread or something else, how does the salt content make sense in this context? So that's what we're going to take a look at. And there are some strategies. We'll start by looking at nutrition labels. The FDA does tell us that we have to disclose on the nutrition facts label the amount of sodium, and they have to disclose exactly what the amount is per serving. And the way that you find that out is you have to make sure that you might look at a package and think to yourself, oh my gosh, 850 milligrams of sodium. So if you look to your far right on the nutrition facts label in the yellow section, #3, they have to tell you how much sodium is in something. So here, this is for a lasagna, and it says 850 milligrams, but it's for the serving size of 1 cup. So the most important thing is to always check what the serving size is and realize that 1 cup of lasagna, according to this package here, is going to have 850 milligrams. Well, that's more than half of what you're allotted for the day, or it's not half of what you're allotted for. So theoretically, for the rest of the day, you can eat lower sodium options to get up to that 2,000, 2,300. Now, let's say you ate 2 cups. That's where you have to start to be careful, because the serving size is very, very specific. So for example, if you ate 2 cups of lasagna, then you have to double that amount, and you're eating about 1,700 milligrams a day. So you still have some other options for the rest of the day. So this would be a great day to have a really large serving of lasagna and salad on the side with a dressing that is lower in sodium. And that's how you would do that. So the most important thing for nutrition facts labels is to always, always, always make sure that you look at how many milligrams of sodium something has in what serving size. Because I don't know about you, but if I'm going to eat chips and they tell me a serving size is a 1/4 cup, but they put 2 cups in the bag of chips, I'm probably going to eat the whole bag. Don't tell anyone. So I have to factor that in, right? That's a very salt heavy day. Then I have to find other ways of eating less sodium rich foods for the rest of the day. But that's how I would do that. I would be mindful knowing that the amounts will add up based on the serving. Hopefully that makes sense. And then, of course, the nutrition facts label is also going to tell you what the calories are and some of the other nutrients that are important for you to know as well. Now, another question I typically get from folks who are reading nutrition facts labels is you might notice that some of the advertising is going to say low sodium or reduced sodium or no salt added or unsalted. And what does it all really mean? What I did was we were able to put together this table for you to kind of help you understand exactly what these titles mean, because sometimes things will be labeled salt or sodium free. They might be labeled very low sodium, reduced sodium, but what does it all really mean? So if you're looking at something, for example, let's look at low sodium. That's one that I commonly see at the grocery store, for example. If the package says it's low sodium, it will be 140 milligrams of sodium or less per serving. And so that is actually quite low sodium. So if throughout the day you're choosing low sodium options, those would be really good options. Typically, what I like to tell people is that you want to look on average for food items that are going to be less than 300 milligrams per serving. And if you do that throughout the course of the day, what you'll notice is you'll end up having the right amount of sodium, which will range somewhere between 2 and 2,300 milligrams. That's a really good way of doing it. If you start having foods per serving that are 300 milligrams or more, that's when you have to be very strategic and eat your salads or do more vegetables that are lightly seasoned, or you can find sodium alternatives. So focus more on things like spices in order to get that flavor, but not rely on the sodium as much. Light in sodium or lightly salted, at least 50% less sodium than the regular product. That one I don't utilize as much because it's a little bit more vague. I will then go to the nutrition facts and I will check to make sure that number is 300 or less. And that's kind of how I like to manage that, because 300 is a good reference number to remember. And if a lot of the foods throughout the day are going to be 300, you'll land in about the right range. And then very low sodium is going to be 35 milligrams of sodium or less per serving, which is indeed quite low. And then salt or sodium free is going to be 5 milligrams or less, and that's quite negligible. And if you see that on a package, then it's a good sign that that is an option that is really good, especially if you're looking to have 1,500 milligrams, for example. And then I really like having this slide as a reference point and kind of sharing that with people. And this is a very sort of accurate way of, if you're going to the grocery store and looking for things very specifically, this is a good chart to have, because companies do typically use this low sodium, reduced sodium, that kind of advertising to help consumers and customers see what is exactly in their products. All right, so I scanned in a sample menu from our community. This one was from quite a while back. All of our communities have access to what we call a nutrient analysis, and we are able to pull up a very good estimate of how much sodium is in those products and in the recipes. So this nutrient analysis is created based on what the ingredients are. And it's a really, really good way of gauging exactly how much sodium you might have throughout the day. Now, what you might notice here is, so I have each column is a day. So it's Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday onwards. And then the very top line is our soups. Then you have your salad option. So for example, if we look at the first column, I have green split pea soup, and then I have a fennel and roasted veggie salad. Then I have an option of 2 entrees. For example, I have a tri-tip and I have a pork chop. Then I have some starch, so maybe mashed potatoes, jasmine rice. And then I always have 2 veggies. And then I have a dinner roll or some other kind of like a hamburger bun or maybe 7-grain bread sometimes. And then I have a dessert. So that's typically what our menu might look like. Maybe at your community, your menu might look just a little bit different, but in general, you will probably have a lot of similarities here. And what I've done here is I quickly jotted down some of the numbers. So all the numbers that you might see, like for example, the third column from the left, carrot ginger soup on the top is 185 milligrams per serving. All of our soups are typically 6 ounces. So that's actually really good. That's under 300. So that soup is pretty good. One thing I like to tell my residents is that the things to watch out for example, let's say you're really trying to watch your salt because your blood pressure has been kind of high and your doctor is looking at you like, hey, you got to lay off the salt. You might be wondering, okay, which items do I need to pay attention to the most? So here's what I tell my residents. I tell them a lot of the times the soups might be the most sodium rich, and that's because of the stock. And then if it has, for example, pork in it, pork products typically, because of how they are processed and cooked, they will have more sodium usually. Now, of course, I'm really sorry, you guys, but no bacon. And sausages, breakfast sausages, things like that, or cured meats, deli meats, those unfortunately are the ones that we have to start looking at first. They will be the most sodium rich. Then you have your ham, of course. Ham, if you look at root beer glazed ham, that one was really, really high. And then you also have to look a little bit at your desserts because of those crusts. A lot of the times there will be quite a bit of sodium, and you might be thinking you're doing really great for the day, but then you might have dessert and that might put you over your range. So let's see, I also wanted to mention, okay, so let's take a look at the fourth column, entree. We have root beer glazed ham. As you can tell, that one's very sodium rich. So you might be wondering, all right, well, I like root beer glazed ham. That sounds amazing, right? The way I like to think about sodium intake, and if I'm talking with my residents, I'm not just looking at one meal. And I think this could be helpful for you as well. I'm looking at sodium for the week and I'm looking for the day. So for this day, this is just lunch. This is a lunch menu. If, for example, you really love root beer glazed ham, what I would tell you is you can have a serving of that, but then you want to make sure that you get your veggies. And then maybe you don't want to have chicken noodle soup with that, right? Because then that's going to put you at over 1,500, especially if you start to add other things. So you can find your favorites, and then you want to add things in. You want your green beans, you want your cabbage, you want your polenta, you want those things to be added. Your salads, pomegranate and orange salad was on as the salad of the day. Then it will help to offset your sodium intake. And what it'll also do is it will give you other micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, fiber, and water to help offset the really, really high sodium rich entree that you picked. And then for dinner, you might want to pick something that's also lower sodium. And that is how I recommend people typically look at their sodium consumption. You want to think about it: breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snacks. That's really the best way, because remember, you can, unless your doctor says otherwise, can go up to 2,300 milligrams. And then let's say for the week, let's say you look at the menu and you're like, you know, this week it's going to be a really great menu and it's going to have a lot of really great stuff, but I know it's going to be salty. So for example, you have your pulled pork on, what is that, Sunday, Monday? The third column, you have your pulled pork, root beer glazed ham. But then you have to say to yourself, okay, am I going to do the meatballs, which is your second to last column from the right? Am I going to have pork stew? So you then start to think about, for the week, where can I have the things that I love? But then for like dinner, for breakfast, maybe I'm not going to have bacon and pork for lunch, right? And I'm going to have a lighter dinner. This is really the best way to manage your diet overall, by looking at the numbers. If you like puzzles or games, this can be fun too, because you can kind of see, okay, these days I can do this day I can do that, and I can still have meatballs. That way, you're always thinking in terms of, what are my milligrams for the week and what are they for the day? And what we find as we start to look at how people eat, there's a pattern that emerges. You're unlikely to want to eat only salty food all of the time. You're going to kind of go a little bit salty and then not so much. And it's going to be a wave. And over the week, it will help to even you out. So if you start to pay attention to your salt intakes, it will be really, really helpful to see it that way, I think. That way you can have pulled pork, but maybe something lighter for dinner. And just by looking at the numbers, you'll see that you start to average out. Let's see, ham with soup. All right, so the things I wanted to mention were those. And if we go to the next slide, it's going to be the exact same picture. But this one, we are going to take a look at what can your menu look like if you're mindful, right? So for example, if you look at the third column, if we're mindful of sodium, then we might pick something like, I picked the high sodium items. If you can kind of see on the slide, I have some stars. So for example, if you have carrot ginger soup, coleslaw, and you splurge, right? You have your barbecue pulled pork, which is 470 milligrams. You have some potatoes, you have some roasted tomatoes, and you have the hamburger bun, which if you'll notice is 241. And you have your cranberry apple crisp, that's 1,286 for lunch. If you are kind of keeping track of it that way, for dinner, you can choose an entree that is not as sodium rich. And what you'll notice is by the end of the day, especially if you have not the sausage and not the bacon for breakfast, you might have something like eggs or an omelet. You might have like a yogurt or maybe some fruit. That'll generally be low sodium. At the end of the day, you'll be in your range. You'll be somewhere between 2,000 and 2,300. And that's quite typical. So even let's take a look at the fourth column. Let's say you really wanted to do the root beer glazed ham because it's delicious, of course. Then you kind of look at your numbers and you see, okay, well, I can't have the chicken noodle soup, right? Because that's also very sodium heavy. Then you might have the pomegranate orange salad, which is very low. It's only 90 milligrams. And then you'll have some of your polenta, you'll have some cabbage, some nice green beans, a dinner roll, and pudding, and you're still in about that 1,200 range. So if you were interested in doing something like that, you could look at our nutrient analysis, and it's already all laid out. And you can see what are the high value or high sodium items. And then what you can start to notice as well, of course, is that your veggies, your starches, they're typically going to be lower. And the things that you want to be mindful of is you always, always, always want to have your fruits and veggies, right? You want your salad. And that will really help you to round out your meal, have a balanced, healthy diet, and have some of these higher sodium items. If we go back to the previous slide, where you might get into some trouble, or actually we don't have to go to the previous slide, where you might run into trouble is if you then have, for example, in the fourth column, chicken noodle soup, then you have your root beer glazed ham, and then you have everything else. That's when we start to have some challenges. And this is a really great way to plan your menus, especially if you're being mindful of sodium. All right, so that was an overview of kind of how the menu is set up here, but you might be wondering, okay, so now we know about the menu, the structure, you know that you have access to a nutrient analysis. You know that you can look at your sodium intake for the week. You can kind of look at it for the day. You can choose high sodium items, knowing that you have to then have lower sodium for your other meals. What are some other tips to cut sodium? Let's take a look. You can read your nutrition facts labels and make sure you're getting 300 milligrams or less per item or per serving. Don't add salt to your food at the table. You want to also focus on adding things in. I hate to take things away, like bacon, but I want to encourage you to add in. I want you to add things like fruits, vegetables, and salads. That will help to bring in the micro elements and nutrients that you need in order to help, not dilute, but to bring in other things that you need to metabolize the sodium correctly. So you have your fiber, your water, you need all these things to help metabolize salt correctly. And then you want to reduce your processed foods because things like cookies, cakes, snacks, chips, of course, are going to have a lot more sodium. And then also be adventurous. Try different herbs and seasonings and spices. There's a lot of blends that are salt-free. And that leads me to another question you might be wondering about. What are all these sodium alternatives all about? Before I go into them, just a really quick disclaimer. There are certain medical conditions that make it so that your doctor will tell you, hey, you got to make sure that you're watching your potassium intake. If that is you, you have to make sure that if you're also then watching your sodium, that you don't want to buy a sodium alternative, which will a lot of the times rely on potassium to give that same salty feeling, but it's potassium that's in there. So if that's you and that's something you know you have to watch for, make sure that you're looking at the ingredients labels to make sure there's not potassium in your salt alternatives. Salt alternatives are really good. There's a lot of great ones on the market. There's just one that one of my residents told me about, never heard about it before, something called green salt. It's made from a sea vegetable. And you may or may not know, but sea vegetables typically, because they're coming from the sea, have that salty taste to them. But this one in particular has 50% less sodium than salt by weight, but it'll still have that salty taste to it. I haven't tried it. One of my residents told me about it, so I thought I would just include that because I thought it was interesting. Then you have things like Mrs. Dash. What I like about Mrs. Dash is it has great flavor, easily accessible, and it's also salt and potassium free. And they have a line that's been developed. So they have an assorted mixture that you can try. So there's more variety for you to try. Then you have something, and by the way, I just randomly searched for a lot of these. The market is so developed in terms of what's available to you. You could really go on Amazon or anywhere and Google any salt alternative, and it will give you a lot to look at. So the way I approach it is, are you trying to minimize potassium? If that is the case, then just read your ingredients. I try to stick to more natural ingredients because you want to do seasonings, right? You want to do herbs and spices. They have more flavor and they have health benefits. If you start going to the right here, for example, this 0 sodium salt, you start reading the ingredients and you might be confused. You know, what is L-lysine monohydrochloride, glutamic acid, cream of tartar, and silicon dioxide? It doesn't even sound like food, right? So as you start to read these ingredients, if you're questioning any of them because they're not making a lot of sense, you know, maybe that's not the product for you. I typically like to recommend things that I can pronounce and read, which is really your herbs and spices. But just so you're aware, there are a lot of products on the market. Main thing to look at is just the ingredients. And then, of course, I want to always reframe healthy eating. I want to talk about it as part of a general healthy eating plan. So if you have heard any of my talks, I always end with this, My Plate Planner, because what I really want to show you is that you can have salt in your diet and you can have starches, you can have lean proteins, you can have fruits and vegetables. As long as you are eating the proportions that are on this plate, for example, which incidentally, of course, is how we typically do our menu planning. We want to make sure you get your starch, you get your protein, and you get your veggies. You have access to fruits and all these different things. And that's all by design. And of course, we do add salt to our food, and that is also by design because salt really helps to enhance flavors. And it really gives a lot to the food, but that's not the only thing we use. We use different herbs and spices. We try to mix things up. We try to do a sauce. And if you are eating with this balanced plate in mind, you can enjoy some of the saltier foods as long as you know that you have to then maybe eat something lighter for dinner. And then you have to have your veggies, which is probably not surprising to any of you. You want to make sure you're getting some of your fruits in. And that is the best, that you're staying hydrated, of course, because if you eat a lot of salty foods, you might not necessarily be inclined to stay hydrated. It's kind of tricky. The more salt you eat over time, the less likely you are to also then feel thirsty. So make sure that you're staying hydrated. And if you're doing a lot of these different things, you're looking at some of the numbers, reading your nutrient facts labels, using herbs and spices. I think that you will find that you will generally stay in what is typically recommended, which is your 1 teaspoon of salt a day. And what you do is you just spread it out throughout the day. So you're getting a little bit at every meal, and that way you feel satisfied. And then, of course, our little disclaimer, making sure that anytime you are changing your diet significantly, or if you need to control your salt more or less, or if you have any questions, always making sure that you're connecting with your healthcare provider. All right, and I think that brings me to my finish. Thank you all so much. I hope you were able to see as we went through this journey together that salt doesn't necessarily have to be this thing that you eliminate 100%. You need salt to survive. You need it for metabolic processes, but you don't need that much. And so the idea is, how do you plan your meals so that you're enjoying them, but also staying healthy, because cardiovascular disease is one of the #1 things that we all have to worry about, and make sure that we are taking care of our blood pressure. And watching salt, of course, is the main way that you can do that. And if you have any questions, I'd be open to answering some of them. Thank you all so much.
Well, thank you, Annetta. That was fantastic. We really appreciate it. I think that we've all learned a lot. Certainly learned a lot about sodium and salt and ways to be able to minimize our salt intake. And let's see if we have some questions here.
I think we have one question from Mr. Yang in the chat box. If you want to go ahead, Mr. Yang.
Yes, I have a question on soup. You have number there on your chart. I was saying the same soup, sometimes it tastes okay, sometimes too salty. So how was the amount of salt controlled in making soups?
They're typically following a recipe. And sometimes as we are doing menu planning, there are different options for different recipes, and chefs and cooks will sometimes change them out just to maybe try different things. So you might have like a navy bean soup 1, navy bean soup 2, navy bean soup 3, and they might have some slight variations in their sodium. So that could be one of the reasons. In terms of the recipe type, we are picking recipes from a very large database, and sometimes they're not exactly the same. So the salt could be varied by that. And then they're using a soup base sometimes as well. And there could be some variations in the soup base itself.
Has that been studied to screen out the high salt bases?
We try to watch it because we know most of our residents prefer things to be not as salty. So I know that, for example, in our community, we stay very mindful of that. Because it's easy to add salt in, it's very difficult to take it out. Sometimes
That's right.
It can just, yeah. Sometimes it can happen that there's variability between who prepared it. It does happen. But those are some of the things that could be explaining the salt differences for you.
Now,
I hope that answers the question.
yeah, answer my question. But my general concern is that the food that we have is really on average American diet, or this is some really concern. My concern is that you talk about 23,000 milligrams of sodium. That's 0.5.6 grams of salt.
Mhm.
American average intake is about 9 grams. Are we taking the 9 grams, or we? That's my question. But from your chart calculation, it's not. But,
Yeah, I'll go back real quick.
But I have a question about. But is that it? Yeah, those are determined by what? By.
Right. So these numbers that I am specifically referencing have to do with our recipes that we use. So all of our cooks get a printout of whatever soup we make. For example, carrot ginger soup, they get a printout, and based on the ingredients in the soup and based on the serving size, 6 ounces, we can estimate the salt content. And that's how these numbers are generated. They're based off a database with all of our known recipes. And so that's a software that we specifically use in our communities to find out what these numbers are. But you're
Okay.
also right. The general public does consume more than that. We try to stay within a reasonable amount, but as you can tell, there are some recipes that call for either brining, for example, or if you're using ham, that's going to be prepared in such a way that retains more salt just because of how it's prepared. So on those days, I always tell my residents that we have to find other options that are less salty for the day, because that does happen. Some recipes have more salt than others.
Or just take half a serving.
Right, exactly. And typically, we do try to find items that are a little bit lower in sodium, because we recognize that most of our residents are very health conscious. They do care about the salt content. They are watching what they eat, and we try to honor that as much as possible.
Well, perfect. Well, if there are no other questions, again, I want to say thank you to Annetta for such a great presentation, and also want to say thank you to all of you for joining us today. And again, please remember that we have our next webinar coming up on October 18th between 2 and 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and it will be on blood sugar management. So we look forward to seeing you all then. Take care of everybody. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.